Heart goes out to the family of this young man who was just, FedEx worker, father of a young child, on his way home, gets stopped by police, ends up being beaten to death. Absolutely horrific, horrible, horrible, vile crime. This has been turned into, though, and even by the likes of Shadow Foreign Secretary David Lammy, always, always keen to mention that he's a young black man who's been killed, failing in a tweet to mention that he was killed by black police officers. This is being played out as George Floyd, Mark II, Mark III, Mark 44, as an evidence of yet more of institutional racism in police forces in America. Is there any evidence of that?
Well, I think that it's a crying shame that those are the kind of responses that we've seen following the fatal police brutalisation of Tyre Nichols. I find it amazing that people are turning this into a race issue, and I think this should be a discussion on the culture of police brutality in the United States. We're ultimately seeing modern so-called anti-racists providing cover for the 5 black police officers, saying that they were ultimately conditioned and manipulated into this lethal act of violence against a black American citizen. Yeah. And that's ultimately stripping them of all individual agency and personal responsibility.
So basically they work in a culture and in a police system which is so institutionally racist, even though they, as black men themselves, working for a black boss in a largely black police force in a largely black part of the city, that they themselves were somehow ingrained in this idea that black men were people who they should be fearful of and who they should beat to death. I mean, that really shows a very low opinion of those black officers' intellect, does it not?
Well, I would say so, because ultimately that's pushing the narrative that black police officers can be so unthinking and incapable that they can be easily coerced into these lethal acts of violence. And actually, Julie, I think that's dangerously close to the kind of racist, hard-right narratives which suggests that the black race generally it has a naturally low level of intelligence, that it lacks mental ability. So I really think that modern anti-racists should be very careful when they're pushing out those kind of narratives over this.
Yeah, absolutely. But also, again, I thought this even actually over the George Floyd killing, and that came at a time, with lockdowns, and we had that incredible backlash and reaction, and actually, I mean, huge numbers of people died later on in riots and protests and these calls to defund the police. But I mean, his killer, Derek Chauvin, he went to jail, thank God. Evil, horrible, terrible human being, had no business on our streets, let alone as a police officer with that sort of power, and what he did to George Floyd. However, there was lots of evidence that he was just a nasty piece of work to everybody. There were plenty of people who came forward that he'd been incredibly violent towards, who were not black, and it was quite interesting to me that it was turned into a race issue as opposed to a police brutality issue and a police accountability issue, which seems to me to be the issue. And when you look at the statistics for police in America, and again police here in this country, because people often said, oh, it's the same here. Statistically, it really ain't. I mean, it's nothing remotely like that here. But actually, again, there are more white people than black people in America. That will affect the demographics. But in terms of people who are more likely to be killed by police officers, it doesn't stand out, actually, that black people are being particularly targeted in that way. There will be some racist officers, absolutely. But the main issue is police brutality.